Hello once again, this is Jonathan Miller with the Hometown Historian channel. We are here doing another episode of the Haunted History series. This place should look familiar. This is where Cliff and I did the first parts of our videos for the Blue-Eyed Six story. And we are back here at St. Joseph's Spring. This is a small town on the other side of the creek here. There were a number of the houses, and I figured one of the things that would probably be good to do, since it's considered probably the most haunted area in Lebanon County, having to do with the Blue-Eyed Six and all that, I figured why not come here and talk about a few of the legends, a few of the myths, things like that. I do want to be a little careful and be a little cautious in regard to a couple of tales that have to do with the Moonshine Church, because as I said in the video, a lot of the stuff that does get talked about, some of the weird myths and legends and stuff like that, are purely human made. Some of them didn't even occur on the spot but are credited to being at that spot. So I just wanted to talk. It's a pretty cool look down into the water there. It's a little clearer, but anyways, this is right here, about maybe 10 or 12 feet down this direction is where the murder of Joseph Raber happened with the Blue-Eyed Six. Now the water is a lot higher than it used to be because there's a trout fishery down here and they have a dam. So at the time of the murder, it would have only been like 8 to 12 inches deep. So that's during normal times. And across the stream over there would have been where Israel Brandt's tavern had been, more on the left. And then straight ahead would have been where Charles Drews, who is the man that was hired for the murder. But some of the stories that surround around the valley, this is called the Fishing Creek Valley, or it was at the time before it eventually in the 1880s was called Greenpoint. They had a number of things after the Blue-Eyed Six had, 5 of the 6 had actually been hung for murder or conspiracy to murder. I believe Charles Drews and Franklin Strickler were convicted of murder, and the other 3 guys were convicted of conspiracy to murder. The only one that was acquitted was George Zekman, but he got consumption, which is basically a nastier version of tuberculosis, while he was in prison, because they were in prison for quite a while. And he wound out living 7 years after that, but consumption's ultimately what killed him. And also, the son-in-law of Charles Drews, who's the one that ultimately told on them, he died of consumption as well. And a lot of people said that both men, George Zekman and Joseph Peters, the son-in-law of Charles Drews, the consumption was basically their punishment for one lying, and for Zekman for actually being part of the conspiracy, and he most likely was. But anyway, so the 5 men that were hung, and Joseph Raber, who was the man that they murdered, there's a lot of ghost stories surrounding around these guys. A lot of them have to do with the Moonshine Cemetery, which is where Joseph Raber, the victim, is buried. Now, we went to all the different sites where the other men are buried. None of the other men, the Blue-Eyed Six, were ever buried or reburied at Moonshine Cemetery, but they did talk about a paranormal team went to the Moonshine Cemetery and talked to Joseph Raber, and he had said he didn't understand what all the fuss was about him, because in life no one cared about him, why should they in death? Which is a really sad statement on life for this guy, and it's probably unfortunately true, because he was sort of known in the Fishing Creek Valley as sort of this hobo and just a beggar around the entire valley. And he lived in a pretty derelict and degenerate state. It would have been over on that side of the creek, right near Israel Brandt's hotel. He was actually, his common law wife was the sister of Charles Drews' wife, and it's basically a hovel with a dirt floor, and he lived in that year-round and basically lived off of what people gave him. So he wasn't a hated man, but he was a man that really was sort of a joke and was considered a village idiot because he wasn't that bright. None of the guys that were part of the Blue-Eyed Six were that bright either, because otherwise they wouldn't have done what they did. But as we've talked about before, desperate times create desperate people, and desperate people do desperate things, and that's sort of what had happened. So, but some of the hauntings they have in the area, they talk about, they actually have, they say there's some Native American spirits that actually will go around the Moonshine Cemetery, which once again, whether that's true or not, and they also would say you'd see these blue orbs, which would be for sort of like the blue eyes of the blue-eyed six. And there's a couple other things as well, which, you know, I really sort of doubt any of them. And, you know, if you do ever visit Moonshine Cemetery, because it's like the Moonshine's considered one of the most haunted places, and it's mainly just because of the tales that people have either made up or things of that nature. And they really the church got tormented, especially in like the 80s and into the 90s. So if you do visit the cemetery, it is from dawn to dusk. They don't want the people there after dark. So just respect their cemetery and respect the church, because they're really good people and they don't deserve to continue to get that nonsense happening. But they do talk about, they say that the blue-eyed six occasionally are around that cemetery as well. Maybe partially in seeking forgiveness from Joseph Raber. Maybe there's a more nefarious reason. Nobody really knows. The one tale that was sort of interesting, Henry Wise, who's buried at the Greenpoint Meeting House Cemetery, they had a relic hunter, I guess as you could call it, went and actually dug his grave up and stole his skull. And they say that Henry Wise marches up and down the valley looking for a skull, even though they actually did find the person that did it, because they didn't hide what they did very well, and I guess they talked about it, so they were caught pretty quickly and the skull was returned. They also talk about in the where the old Lebanon County courthouse was, which is where the 5 men were hung. The paranormal team went in to where is now the Lebanon Farmers Market, because the county courthouse had actually burnt down. They went to there and went to see if they could talk to any spirits, and they talked to Henry Wise, who said simply, "I am dead," which is true. Once again, how much of these things are true and how much of them aren't, nobody really knows. I mean, but it's still cool, because it is one of those things that it has elicited a lot of a response, because the Blue-Eyed Six was a world-renowned crime. And it's an interesting story. So, you know, they had just as to talk about the interesting nature of it, Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes series, actually wrote a short story called The Red-Headed League, based off of the Blue-Eyed Six story. So there's a lot of things about it, and I think anything that has a horrific nature as well is one of those things that will wind out having haunting stories coming off, because it's a traumatic end, especially for Franklin Strickler. His end, normally when you hung, the way they did the noose and the way they dropped you, the gravity would just instantly kill you, because it would snap your neck. But apparently in his case it didn't, and he actually hung for 10 minutes and strangled. And they said it was a pretty graphic and horrible sight. I mean, at the end of the day, he paid for his crime, but it's still an awful way for anybody to go. But so that's a little bit of the Blue-Eyed Six, talking about some of the hauntings there and some of the different weird things. There are a lot of weirder things that, like I said, a lot of them happen to be done human by nature. It's one of the reasons that a lot of cemeteries, if there is some kind of weird haunting story about it in connection to their cemetery, they usually try to keep it hush-hush, because unfortunately it does bring a certain crowd in. Moonshine dealt with a lot of people with the occult and that type of stuff, would be doing seances and a lot of vandalism to the church itself and to the property. So they are a little touchy about it, which is completely understandable, which is why I want to be careful with how much I say, because there are other tales, and the next one is less believable than the one before it, but it is one of those things that with haunted history, there's small kernels of truth or a basis within fact, I guess you could say. And so it's interesting. I mean, I think it's something that we always, every single one of us, I think for the most part, enjoys those fireside tales, the scary tales and that type of stuff, because it sort of gets your juices flowing. So this is just one of those stories. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Blue-Eyed Six and some of the stuff that has to do with them here at St. Joseph Springs. where the murder actually occurred, the Blue-Eyed Six, and then just some of the hauntings that come with it and in this area. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye to our next adventure. We're actually going to go right down the road here and talk about another character from legend and lore. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you all about town.